What does a man become when he chooses truth over empire? Not survival. Not comfort. Not even legacy. But truth, raw, defiant, and radioactive. The kind of truth that costs you everything and spits on your corpse when you fall. April 28, 1967. A room. Fluorescent lights. A name is called. Cassius Marcellus Clay. A beat of silence. Then movement. He stands, but he does not step forward. In that instant, time doesn't tick. It screams. This isn't about boxing. It never was. This is about something far more volatile. Something every powerful hand in America had tried to muzzle, a black man who would not kneel, not for war, not for whiteness, not for a crown built on compliance. He was 25. Undefeated. World champion. A living spectacle of speed and prophecy. And he just told the United States government, no. 3 letters. A word sharp enough to break history in half. No. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was standing there, straight-backed and deadly calm, refusing to take one step toward the killing fields of Vietnam. Not out of fear. Out of fire. Because he knew what they didn't want you to know. The war wasn't just overseas. It was here. On American soil. In the minds of children trained to bow. In the fists of police. In the courtroom whispers. In the draft papers signed in ink that bled. The backlash was instant. The punishment, biblical. Stripped of his title. His license revoked. Sentenced to 5 years in prison. Banned from the sport at the peak of his power. For what? For daring to live by principle in a world that rewards performance. But here's what they didn't calculate. You can take a man's title. You can banish him. Erase him from the airwaves. Choke off his income. Threaten his future. But you cannot kill a man who refuses to be owned. That's what Muhammad Ali became, not just a fighter in the ring, but a walking contradiction too dangerous to ignore, a black man who would rather lose everything than sell his soul to the system. And here's the part that burns in the shadows. The government thought they were punishing him. They were building a legend. The media tried to silence him. They etched his name into stone. They thought he'd vanish. He became immortal. But this isn't a story of glory wrapped in gold foil. This is a man dragged through fire, spit out the other side, and still standing. Because sometimes, the greatest battles don't happen between ropes. They happen when one man decides he will not be owned by any flag, any crown, any lie. And if you think this is just about boxing, you haven't been paying attention. This is about war, race, religion, and the cost of saying no when the whole world is screaming yes. Ready or not, you're already inside. The boy stood on the edge of a thunderstorm, fists clenched, lips trembling, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of silence. Louisville, Kentucky. The air thick with the taste of metal and memories no child should carry. The world had told him who he was supposed to be, quiet, grateful, invisible. But he refused. Even then. His name was Cassius Clay, and he was already a noise too loud for segregation to smother. They stole his bike, and something inside him snapped. Not sorrow. Not sadness. A spark. A boy didn't cry. He found a police officer. Told him he wanted to whoop whoever took it. The officer laughed, until he saw the fire behind those young eyes. That cop, Joe Martin, showed him a gym instead of a jail. Offered him gloves instead of revenge. But he had no idea what he'd just unleashed. This wasn't about a bicycle. It was about reclaiming control in a world that stripped it away at every corner. About proving that he mattered when the streets screamed otherwise. And so, Cassius punched. He trained like a boy on the run from the very skin he was born in, faster, sharper, louder. He wasn't just learning how to fight. He was learning how to be heard. Every jab was a question the world had no answer for. Every uppercut, a defiance of the rules that kept his people chained to the gutter. He wasn't built to bow. And with each passing day, he grew taller, quicker, louder in mind and body. Not arrogant. Uncontainable. Louisville was too small to hold him. Then came Rome, 1960. The Olympics. The stars and stripes stitched to his chest. Gold on his neck. 18 years old, standing above the world. He should have felt proud. He should have felt like an American. But when he came home, medal shining, head high, he still couldn't eat at a whites-only diner. Still couldn't use the same toilet. The gold meant nothing to the ones holding the leash. So he tossed the medal into the Ohio River. Let it sink where his illusion of equality had already drowned. That was the first burial. Not of a trinket, but of Cassius the believer. Boxing didn't love him either. It feared him. The swagger. The poetry. The audacity. He danced when they wanted him still. Spoke when they wanted silence. He wasn't just winning, he was humiliating. Sonny Liston was the final wall. The mob's enforcer. A bear in gloves. Unbeatable. Untouchable. Ali beat him with his mouth before the first punch even flew. I shook up the world. And the world hated it. Not just because he won. But because he smiled. Because he refused to be humble. Because he wouldn't play the grateful Negro. He turned victory into art, and art into rebellion. Then, almost overnight, he shed the last skin the world gave him. Cassius Clay was dead. His name was Muhammad Ali now. A new birth, not just of a man, but of a threat the white establishment couldn't define, couldn't control. The Nation of Islam welcomed him. The press recoiled. He wasn't the people's champion anymore. He was their champion. Black. Bold. Unforgiving. They called him a traitor. A radical. They called him dangerous. And they were right. Because he had finally become unafraid. In whispered conversations, they talked about him like a virus. In locker rooms, in boardrooms, in government halls. A boxer wasn't supposed to think, wasn't supposed to preach, wasn't supposed to stare America in the eye and say, "You're lying." Malcolm X saw it. Called him brother. Lit the fuse. Their bond was electric, sacred, doomed. The world watched as Malcolm began to break away from the nation, and Ali, still young, still loyal, turned his back. The betrayal cut deeper than any hook to the ribs. Months later, Malcolm's body bled out on a stage in Harlem. And Ali, he carried that silence for years. A silence louder than his boasts. Guilt can't be boxed away. But even as he mourned in private, in public he became larger than sport. His fists weren't weapons anymore, they were microphones. Every bout, every press conference, every insult hurled back like a grenade. He was transforming into prophecy. Yet behind the flash, behind the rhymes, a storm brewed. The world wasn't done punishing him for daring to exist outside their script. The men in suits were waiting. Not to fight, but to erase. The war drums were pounding. Vietnam loomed. And Ali, standing on the edge of a history that wanted to own him, had already made up his mind. The next blow wouldn't come from a ring. It would come from a letter. And this time, when the name was called, he would not step forward. The letter waited like a knife on the kitchen table. White paper. Black ink. Government seal pressed into the corner like a cold finger. Muhammad Ali stared at it. Not with surprise. With knowing. The silence around him wasn't silence, it was the slow hiss of something about to ignite. He didn't move. Didn't blink. The air around him pressed inward, like the walls were listening. He picked it up. Tore it open. Read the words. You are hereby ordered for induction. The United States government wanted his body. Not his mind. Not his voice. Just his blood. His limbs. His usefulness. To send across an ocean to kill strangers who had never once called him boy. And the words came, like thunder behind his teeth. Unapologetic. Immovable. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. 16 words. 16 bullets aimed not at a war, but at the lie beneath it. They called him un-American. A traitor. A coward. They said he was scared to fight. But tell that to the thousands of black bodies who had already been zipped up in bags, returned to neighborhoods that wouldn't even hire them. Tell that to the mothers who buried sons who never knew freedom, not in Saigon, not in Harlem, not in Mississippi. The war had another name in Black America, white men sending black boys to die for something they never had. And now the most visible black man in the world, the heavyweight champion of the world, was saying no. Not quietly. Not respectfully. Loud. Righteous. Unforgivable. They told him war was his duty. He asked if justice wasn't. They said he should be grateful to this country. He asked when it had ever been grateful to him. The United States was burning. Cities trembling beneath the weight of protest and police boots. Civil rights marches. Attack dogs. Water hoses. Churches bombed. Schools guarded by soldiers to protect little black girls from grown white mobs. Lynchings not in history books, but on last night's news. And while that hellstorm howled at home, the draft board pointed across the sea and said, "Go fight there." Ali saw through it. The draft wasn't about patriotism, it was about obedience. The kind that black men were expected to give without question. He had already violated that code when he changed his name, when he stopped bowing, when he stopped being Cassius and became something untamed. He didn't just say no to the war. He said no to America's favorite illusion that it was just. The government didn't hear a boxer refusing a war. They heard a black man refusing to be owned. And that scared them more than any enemy on foreign soil. Behind desks, pale hands signed papers. Inside courtrooms, white faces hardened. They stripped him of his license, his passport, his titles. 3 years of exile ripped from his prime. Not because he was wrong. Because he wouldn't kneel. The media crucified him. Sports writers who once praised his speed now mocked his faith. Called him arrogant. Called him ungrateful. But he knew what they were afraid to admit, that their children would read about this moment in shame. He could have folded. Could have cut a deal. Played the hero in uniform. Smiled, saluted, boxed again. But that would have meant wearing a mask thicker than any glove. He chose fire instead. And the Nation of Islam stood behind him, not as handlers, but as armor. They didn't just teach him religion, they gave him a spine the world couldn't snap. Gave him words that burned through cameras. Gave him truth, even when it came at the cost of safety, of friendships, of comfort. That's what the government underestimated. They thought they were threatening a boxer. But they were facing something ancient. Something dangerous. A man who belonged to no one. Every news clip became a battlefield. Every quote, a Molotov. He wasn't just answering questions, he was exposing the rot. Why fight in a war where the bullets fly thousands of miles away, when the rope still hangs from the trees back home? Why kill for freedom, when freedom won't sit beside you at the lunch counter? His voice grew louder. Not just in volume, but in weight. Each word carried scars, truths, anger sharpened over centuries. His voice was no longer just his own, it was generational. And the more he spoke, the more the nation fractured. College students rose with him. Protesters raised fists in his name. Soldiers started asking why. Athletes began to wonder if winning was really worth their silence. Ali had become more than a fighter. He was now a fault line. And the country trembled every time he opened his mouth. But still, the draft board waited. The court waited. The reckoning was coming. And when they called his name again, he would have to stand, not just as a symbol, but as a target. Because saying no once had set the world on fire. Saying it again might burn it to the ground. The room held its breath. April 28, 1967. Houston, Texas. The walls inside the Armed Forces Induction Center stood still, sterile, silent, like they knew something history didn't yet. A clock ticked too loudly. Boots scraped floors in rhythm. The air carried the weight of judgment, sharp and suffocating. Every eye was fixed on the tall black man in the dark suit. Muhammad Ali stood alone. No gloves. No ring. No crowd screaming his name. Just a machine of war, humming quietly, waiting to eat him alive. They called his name once. He didn't flinch. They called it again. Louder. Sharper. A voice rehearsed to break men who forget their place. Still, he stood still. Then, one final time. Cassius Marcellus Clay. And with a voice as calm as a storm before detonation, he answered. I do not step forward. Time fractured. For a split second, reality bent. The world tilted sideways. And every man in uniform, every pencil-pushing official in that room knew what had just happened. A king had refused a throne of blood. The officers moved fast. Like they'd been trained for this moment. They read the script, shoved papers, snapped commands. They took him to the side, told him what he'd just done. Told him the consequences. But he already knew. The words didn't shake him. Not the indictment. Not the federal threat. Not the looming prison sentence. He wasn't defiant, he was free. Outside, the storm exploded. Media cameras spun like vultures in heat. Reporters swarmed, microphones out like daggers. Headlines wrote themselves in ink and venom. Ali refuses draft. Coward. Traitor. Boxing's shame. They stripped him of everything. His heavyweight title vanished like it never existed. Boxing licenses revoked. Fights canceled. Paychecks evaporated. Sponsors gone. Just like that, they tried to erase him. But erasure only works on the obedient. Ali didn't beg. Didn't apologize. He stood on television screens across America and set fire to every expectation, every myth of patriotism wrapped in hypocrisy. His voice, measured, molten, righteous, cut through the noise. I have been warned that to take such a stand would cost me millions of dollars. But I have said it once and I will say it again. The real enemy of my people is here. The backlash was immediate. The same sports writers who once praised his footwork now wanted his head. Columnists foamed at the mouth, demanding jail, silence, banishment. They said he was poisoning the youth. They said he'd never fight again. They were right about one thing: this wasn't about boxing anymore. It was about truth. Martin Luther King Jr. stepped into the fire beside him. Quiet strength met roaring resistance. King had already turned against the war, but now, standing with Ali, the line was drawn in concrete. Two of the most powerful black voices in America, united not by politics, but by conviction. And the country couldn't handle it. While soldiers bled in jungles across the Pacific, America made an example out of Ali. They handed him a conviction: 5 years in prison, $10,000 fine. He didn't blink. He'd already counted the cost. The hardest punch wasn't thrown in a ring, it came from the silence. Friends vanished. Promoters distanced. Athletes, terrified of losing their own golden cages, said nothing. The phone stopped ringing. 3 years of nothing. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of knowing he'd done the unthinkable and was still standing. They couldn't kill him, so they tried to box him into obscurity. But the silence only made him louder. On college campuses, and barbershops, and burned-out neighborhoods and rich suburban homes, people whispered his name with something between fear and reverence. Did you hear what Ali did? And beneath it all, the question no one wanted to ask: what if he was right? He didn't need a ring. The world had become his arena. His presence, even in exile, was electric. Dangerous. Untamed. You could hear the tremble behind the mockery on television. Hear the panic in the editorials. Because here was a man who'd lost everything America promised him and still refused to kneel. He could have run. He could have fought under another name, in another country. He could have vanished. But he stayed. Faced it all. Alone. No mask. No retreat. No compromise. And that, more than the quote, more than the refusal, more than the exile, that is what shook the world. He wasn't just standing against the war. He was standing against the lie beneath it all. And now that lie was staring back at him through courtroom windows, prison bars, and TV screens, trembling. Because the man who had everything and chose nothing was now something they couldn't define. And he wasn't done fighting. The microphone crackled as he stepped onto the stage. Not Madison Square Garden. Not Las Vegas. No flashing lights. No gold-trimmed robes or ring announcers screaming his name into the sky. Just a wooden podium in a quiet college auditorium. Dim lights. A folding chair behind him. Faces in the crowd, young, uncertain, hungry. Some black, some white. All waiting. Muhammad Ali cleared his throat. Not to fight, but to speak. He looked thinner. Slower. His suit hung heavier on his shoulders than any championship belt ever had. But his eyes, they burned. Lit from the inside with something boxing could never give him. He leaned in, his voice low and cutting. They took my title. They took my livelihood. But they can't take my soul. A silence fell across the room so thick it choked the air. That sentence, sharp, unfiltered, unflinching, hung in the space like a blade. This was exile. No ring. No paydays. No bright lights. Just a man walking into buildings that didn't want him, standing in front of crowds unsure if they should cheer or shrink away. The government had silenced his fists. So he turned his voice into a weapon. And it hit harder than anything he'd ever thrown. They called him un-American. He smiled. They called him a draft dodger. He shrugged. They said he'd thrown away his prime. That was true. He was 25 when they took his license. 25 and undefeated. 25 and the most electric athlete the world had ever seen. Now he was 26. Then 27. Then 28. 3 years. Gone. While other men aged into their greatness, Ali waited. Not in peace. Not in comfort. But under the crushing weight of courts, headlines, unpaid bills, and whispered betrayals. Friends disappeared. Television turned its back. Newspapers spat venom, day after day, column after column. His name was poison. And still he stood. Not on ropes, but on college campuses in the middle of nowhere. At small-town churches. In union halls. Sometimes paid. Often not. No million-dollar purses here. Just folding chairs, blank stares, and the sound of the country waking up to the sound of a man they were told to hate, but couldn't stop listening to. Because what he said made too much sense. They want me to go kill brown people in Vietnam while I can't even sit at a lunch counter in Kentucky. Boom. Not a jab. Not a hook. Just truth, raw and loud and dangerous. He was becoming something else. Something the government couldn't pin down. Something the sports world didn't understand. A fighter outside the ring. A living contradiction they couldn't ignore. He wasn't just talking about the war. He was tearing open the very idea of America, brick by brick. He was telling people what they didn't want to hear. That racism didn't wear uniforms. That injustice didn't need a jungle, it lived on their streets. Some people walked out of his speeches. Others cried. Most sat frozen, caught in the current, unsure whether they were listening to a madman or a prophet. Because he wasn't soft. He wasn't gentle. He mocked, prodded, provoked. He made you squirm. He made you angry. But he made you think. He'd become a mirror, showing the country its own face. And the reflection was unbearable. Ali didn't pretend to be perfect. He spoke his pain plainly. The lost millions. The betrayal of sponsors. The nights wondering if he'd ever fight again. The ache in his body when he shadowboxed in silence, fists flying through the air like they still had somewhere to land. There were nights he screamed into pillows. Nights he stared at the ceiling, fists clenched. Nights when the silence felt like it could swallow him whole. But something inside him refused to break. Because he had purpose now. And people were starting to see it. By 1969, he was no longer a villain. He was a martyr. A symbol. A flame that wouldn't die. Anti-war protesters held signs with his quotes. Students painted murals of his face. The same newspapers that once called him a disgrace now called him controversial, a word they used when they were afraid to say right. And still, the courts dragged on. The Supreme Court hadn't ruled. His conviction still stood. He still faced 5 years in prison. But the tide was turning. You could feel it in the questions from students. In the softening tones of journalists. In the way the world leaned in just a little closer when he spoke. And every time he opened his mouth, he swung again. Not at Foreman. Not at Frazier. But at a country choking on its own lies. He'd been banned from the ring. But the world had become his stage. He wasn't just speaking anymore. He was fighting. And he was winning. It began with silence. Not the silence of a boxing ring waiting for a bell. Not the silence of a courtroom holding its breath. A different silence, still, unnatural. The kind that comes just before something shifts forever. June 28, 1971. 8 men in black robes passed judgment on a man who had refused to bow. A man they had once condemned, now stood before them, without speaking, without begging. They didn't ask for apologies. He didn't offer any. 8-0. Unanimous. Muhammad Ali was free. Not just from a prison sentence. Not just from the weight of a conviction that had stalked him like a shadow for 4 long years. Free from the lie they tried to bury him under. The same country that called him a traitor now watched in awe. Because he never blinked. He never knelt. He walked through fire and came out with his soul untouched. But he was not the same man. They'd taken his prime. Those golden years when a fighter's body is magic, when his instincts are faster than thought. While others danced under lights, Ali had spoken in dark rooms. While others trained, he stood trial. Now, he was back. And the world was waiting. March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. Ali versus Frazier. 2 undefeated champions. One had climbed the ranks in Ali's absence. The other had been stripped, silenced, pushed to the margins, and still came back swinging. They called it the fight of the century. That wasn't enough. It wasn't just fists colliding in a ring. It was a reckoning. Ali walked in not just as a boxer, but as a symbol, living, breathing, pulsing with history. Every punch he threw carried the weight of exile. Every step, a statement. The bell rang. And the garden erupted. Frazier hit like a hammer. Ali bent but didn't break. Blood. Roars. Footwork that made time stutter. 15 rounds. No knockout. No silence. Just war. And when the dust settled, Frazier's hand was raised. Ali had lost. But something strange happened. The people cheered. Not because he lost, but because he was there. Standing. Fighting. Daring to defy the world again. His defeat felt like a victory. Because it proved he was still real. Still human. Still willing to take pain for something greater than himself. Ali would come back again. And again. He would beat Frazier later. He would topple Foreman in Zaire. He would dance. He would bleed. He would rise. But none of it, not even the gold, the roars, the vengeance, meant more than what he had already won. because he had shown what it meant to refuse. What it meant to stand alone in a storm and say, "No, I will not fight your war. I will not betray my God. I will not wear your chains." And the world listened. Athletes who once feared consequences now saw his face and found courage. Kaepernick took a knee, and in the silence of that stadium, Ali's voice echoed. They told Ali to shut up and box. He did not. He became more. A blueprint. A warning. A torch passed from generation to generation. He could have faded after the ring. Could have cashed in, smiled for the cameras, vanished into comfort. But Parkinson's came, slow, cruel, merciless. The man who once floated and stung now trembled. And still, he smiled. Still, he showed up. Lighting the Olympic torch in 1996, his hands shaking, the fire steady. Crowds wept. Not for his weakness, but for his strength. Because the fire had never left him. Even as his body betrayed him, his spirit stood taller than ever. Presidents shook his hand. Children pointed and whispered his name like a spell. Enemies once frothing with hatred now bowed their heads in respect. Because he had walked through the fire and never once screamed. Ali wasn't just a boxer. He was a moment in time, stretched across decades, still swinging. He taught the world that greatness wasn't in gold. It wasn't in belts, or titles, or knockout records. Greatness was saying no when the world screamed yes. It was standing still while the flood tried to drag you under. It was speaking truth when your voice is all you have left. Muhammad Ali died in 2016. But only his body. His legacy is louder now than his punches ever were. Because he didn't just fight in the ring. He fought where it mattered. And in doing so, he became something no man could take from him. Immortal.